What was your reaction, Sue, when you first heard about this? The allegations that Jerry Sandusky had molested boys.
Horror, disbelief. It is still hard to accept. But when I read the first present of charge, I actually got physically ill.
If you love this podcast, I'm sure you're looking for other great true crime podcasts to listen to. Wondery, the network behind this show, has other podcasts for you, especially if you love the way we tell stories here on Real Crime Profile. Great shows like Best Case, Worst Case, Locked Up Abroad, and Hollywood in Crime. All of them are amazing storytellers that you're going to love. So if you're looking for more variation in your podcast like true crime, entertainment, or audio dramas, they're all available from Wondery. Just head to apple.co/Wondery. That's apple.co/Wondery. Or if you're an Android user, head to Wondery.fm.
We are very grateful for the opportunity to be here with you today to kick off Child Abuse Awareness Month. We were among those who were ignorant of the magnitude of the problem. We had been unaware of how a predator behaves, and in many cases, we unknowingly helped him groom his victims.
I'm not here to press the case for my father. It is tough to talk about child abuse. It is hard to recognize, but tougher to talk about. But the best weapon we have is open discussion.
Hello and welcome to Real Crime Profile. This is Jim Clementi, retired FBI profiler, former New York City prosecutor, and writer-producer on CBS's Criminal Minds. And with me today is my lovely co-host.
Oh, nice. Lisa Zambetti. I am the casting director for CBS's Criminal Minds, where my lovely Jim Clementi is my colleague. I have a real interest in real crime and the minds that solve those crimes.
And today we're going to be continuing our discussion with
Scott Paterno, and I'm glad to be back to discuss the case that Jim worked on with me and to hopefully find some answers to some of the questions people have about both the movie and the case.
Well, thank you so much for coming back, Scott. We've kind of gotten deep into this discussion about the movie Paterno, where Al Pacino depicts your father and his life around the time period where Jerry Sandusky was indicted, and unfortunately the fallout of effects after that.
And I just wanted to mention that Laura really wishes that she could have been here today for this conversation. Of course, she's in the UK. We just couldn't get her on the line for this interview, but I know that she would have wanted to weigh in on this conversation as well.
All right, well, let's move forward. One of the things that also stuck out in my mind about the movie was when they depicted your father saying, "Why support Gary and Tim? That's stupid to say that." And this is when Graham Spanier made a statement because Gary Schultz and Tim Curley got indicted along with Jerry Sandusky. They got indicted for endangerment of children, and they got indicted for sort of conspiratorially allowing Jerry Sandusky to take advantage of children sexually. So Spanier made a statement saying that Penn State University stands behind Schultz and Curley. And in the movie, Joe is depicted as saying that he didn't think that that was a smart thing to do. Is that historically accurate as far as you know?
Yeah, but not the way it's presented. So, and I don't mean to nitpick, but yes, he thought making a statement of any kind at that time was inappropriate because there was a legal process that was supposed to play out.
Okay, so Joe really was very much relying on the legitimacy of the legal process and justice system.
Yeah, oh yeah. And that's, you remember, my grandfather was a lawyer. I'm a lawyer, but you know, his view of it, and he had this situation with, there was a player back in 2000, a guy named Richard Casey, who got into a fight outside of a bar in Hoboken. And it happened to be with an off-duty Hoboken police officer. And he's a black kid and the officer's white, and turned into this big, huge story. And everybody wanted Joe to throw the kid off the team. And the kids came back, swore up and down that he didn't do anything. The guy jumped him, and that and sure enough, after going through all the evidence, they choose not to indict Richard because he was jumped. And Dad took all this heat, but he said, "Let the legal process play out. I'm not going to throw the kid off the team. He hasn't been charged. He tells me he didn't do it. I'm going to let this play out." And that was, he took from that a belief that the smart move when the police are involved in this is they do their thing. This is what they do. We just get out of their way. And if they come back to me and tell me this is what happened, then that's what I'll deal with it when that happens. And he's had guys he threw off the team because they came back and they either confessed or what have you to whatever. And he had guys that came back that were innocent and that he had stood by. And so he stayed with that pattern. I think his fear, though, Jim, in that scene and in that moment, in the real moment, was if you come out and put a statement out, you are inviting this into you're inviting scrutiny, not so much into our actions, but into our reactions to what's being put out there. So not a question of, I don't think he was so much concerned about, people looking into Tim. I don't think he was suggesting Tim and Gary were not innocent in this. I think what he was suggesting was if you go out there and say, we stand by them 100%, you are inviting a whole rash of news cycles about Penn State doesn't care about. And that's what he said. I think we should just look like we care and we should just sit back and let this play out.
I think one of the next things that I noticed about the movie was that they depicted your father saying, if it's true, when he's referring to the allegations against Jerry Sandusky. Can you tell us a little bit, if you know, about what was going on in his mind about the allegations against Jerry?
Well, I think his point in saying if it's true is he's looking at it as Jerry hasn't been convicted at this point. He's only been charged and, knows a little bit about the legal system that, the charging document's obviously going to be the prosecution's best foot forward. So he didn't want to condemn. He was never comfortable condemning anybody without, as he said, I didn't see this. I never had a direct report from a victim to me. So how am I supposed to tell you that I know it's true or it's not? And he thought it was best to let the legal process play out. Now, do I think, from the conversations we had and as the stories sort of evolved and as he's reading the presentment, does he start to get a little bit more concerned and more leaning toward the it's true part of it? Sure. But the reality of it is, at that stage, he's still looking at it as we have a legal system that determines guilt, and I'm not going to stand as judge and jury on that.
Okay, and then I want to ask you this, sort of, it wasn't really depicted in the movie, but I want to ask you this. I mean, obviously, at this time, nobody knew that your father, and I'm really sorry to have to bring this up, but
Jim, it's been 6 years.
That your father, I know, but that your father was suffering from cancer at the time. He didn't know, nobody knew. Can you tell us a little bit about, in hindsight now, how that condition, might have affected him? And the reason why I'm asking, as you know, I also went through cancer.
Sure.
It's going on 14 years now ago. And I, as it was happening, I was feeling weaker and weaker and weaker over the months. And the doctor said I could have had it for at least 2 years prior to being diagnosed. And that in my mind, I needed to work out harder because I was feeling weak. I needed to push myself harder because I didn't feel like I had the strength and the drive that I had before. I wasn't recovering from trips as quick as I used to, things like that. And I know that my life was getting harder and harder and harder over those 2 years. And I was 44 at the time, not 84. So I just wonder how that, if you can look back and tell us how you saw the effect of that on your father's life, that he had undiagnosed cancer.
Well, I'll tell you something that's crazy, Jim, is that he had we talked earlier, the reason why he was in the booth is he had gotten hit and had a couple of ribs cracked. So he had a scan done in August that the tumor doesn't show up on. So it was a very aggressive form of cancer. So it came in onset on him fast. It wasn't like but in terms of how it affected him, the funny thing about it is
well, can I just ask you, I'm sorry, but can I just ask you what kind of scan he had?
I forget I'm just telling you what the doctors told us. They said that the scan that they did earlier in the year wasn't there and that it had moved very aggressively. Now, it also had spread too.
Right. But here, let me just tell you what I've learned through this. So I had x-rays that the tumor didn't show up on. How the tumor actually was discovered was that in the x-rays, my trachea became displaced. It got pushed out to the side. So they saw over the course of 2 months that it was moved to 2 inches. And so that showed up. The tumor didn't actually show up in x-rays at all. So I don't know how, what they were talking about, but I also know that I had a very aggressive cancer, and in fact, they said that basically the tumor most likely doubled in size every day. But when you're talking about a tumor starting as one cell and then doubling to two cells, I mean, it takes hundreds of billions and trillions of cells before it's actually visible, right? It has to double, many billions of times before it actually gets significant enough to where it's actually interfering with, organs or whatever. So just, I'm not convinced. I don't know, I'm not a doctor, but I'm not convinced that it wasn't there. Just, to me, you don't get into stage 4 in a matter of months, without it having been there, for a period of time.
Well, and you could be right, Jim. I think that the point you're getting at is that, to what extent does his physical ability impact, his ability, some of the things that were going on, and whether it was from the physical injury or from the cancer. Certainly, he was having, he was an 84-year-old man. I mean, it's just you're 84, and that's. So yeah, it's certainly the problems like with memory and trying to recall certain aspects of a conversation that took place 15 years prior. Sure, it got very, very tough to try to wade through the fog, but at the same time, one of the things there's a scene in the movie where he says, "Well, I'm 84. What do I remember?" And Dan McGinn, the guy that's playing Dan McGinn, basically says, "You can't use that excuse." I can tell you, he never did. There was never a point where he said, "I'm 84, I can't remember." When I asked him questions, he had his recollection. He was definitive in what he could remember, and what he couldn't remember at the time, the first time to the last time he and I had the conversations, it didn't change. He told me the first time I came to him without giving him any heads up that there was an investigation into Jerry and asked him about the situation with Mike. He said, "Yeah, Mike came to me, and I gave it to those guys, and I assumed there was nothing to it because, they never got back to me." That was the first time he and I talked about it. And if you look at his comments throughout it, he came to me, I passed it on. They did, if they needed me, they'd have come back to me.
So I need to ask you this question. Wait, sorry, I have to, because I know my listeners are. Do you think there was any responsibility on his part to follow up and not just say they didn't get back to me, but to follow up and say, what happened with this? Give me the details.
He did follow up with McQuarrie, and McQuarrie said everything's fine, right?
Well, that's Mike says that happened. Dad did not recall that conversation, and whether it's likely Dad would have said something, but I can't speak to it because he didn't recall it before he died, and Mike only brought that up after Dad died, so I couldn't have a chance to ask him about it. But that being said, Lisa, what you're asking is there's two different questions. Do you have a legal responsibility, or do you have a responsibility just because you are Joe Paterno? Sure, I would have loved him to be, a hero, wear a cape, but I can also tell you that knowing my father the way I do, he viewed things as, I deal with the things I know how to handle. And if it's not something, there are people that deal with this that are expert in their field, and I'm going to go ahead and let them do their thing. Now, I asked him point blank, the same question you asked me, Dad, why didn't you just pick up the phone and say, what happened? He goes, because if I pick up that phone and call either, somebody at Old Main, which is Penn State's administration building, or at the police station, at that time, it might have been interpreted as me wanting them to find something on Jerry because Jerry was no longer with the program. And this is stuff that, Lisa, obviously you wouldn't know, but Penn State, Jerry leaves in 99. We hadn't had a losing season in 15 years, losing meaning lost more games than won, in 15 years, and we'd only had one in the previous 60 years. And the next 2 years, the first 2 years Jerry's not on staff, we have just bad luck, bad injuries. We end up going 5-6 both years. And Jerry was around town letting it be known that part of this is because I'm no longer here. And, I was the real impetus behind this whole program, which wasn't true, but it was part of what he was saying in places. And so Dad said retrospectively, it would have been just as bad for me to pick up the phone and call as it would have been not to, in the sense of looking like you're trying to influence an investigation. Now, that's not an absolute, that's not saying that I don't wish there had been something else, and I don't wish that he hadn't seen exactly what he was dealing with, but I don't judge him for having the same lack of ability to see it that even the professionals who were dealing with it at the time.
Yeah, because when you put it in the context of the Department of Child Welfare and the Department of Health for the state, it placed 24 foster children with Jerry Sandusky and 6 adopted children with Jerry Sandusky. They evaluated him every time a judge had to rule on that, right? I mean, every time,
including
the system,
Jim, after the investigation in '98. He was able to adopt another child and foster other children after the allegations in '98 had been raised. Now, whether or not Dad was told about those allegations is been discussed, and I can't speak to it in any intelligent fashion based on the conflicting testimony. But that being said, even if he had been, as you and I discussed both in 2012 and recently, the fact that he had gone through that investigation, was not charged, and then subsequently allowed to continue to adopt and foster children would have created the impression that it was nothing.
Right. Well, not only, I mean, it's not just an impression. I mean, certainly there was an affirmative statement by CSOC, the quote psychologist who was hired by the state to evaluate Sandusky and his actions, that Jerry, in fact, was not a pedophile and he did not have any sexual intent, that it was merely a boundary issue, which he was then directed not to cross again. Of course, he crossed it again, at least in 2001, when McQuarrie saw him in the shower with a boy again. So there's a lot of actual action that happened. And I know that in the movie itself, it said that in 1998, nobody did anything. And the fact is that everybody who was supposed to do something did something. In fact, the process ran through. It's a failure of that system. Mainly, I put that failure basically squarely on the shoulders of CSOC, who made outrageous statements as a quote professional that other people who didn't have those professional qualifications would not have known that he was wrong about those things. They would have thought, because he was the professional, that he's right. And they did, in fact, and they followed up along those lines.
Correct. Yeah.
I got a statement. Sue and I devoted our whole lives to helping young people. The fact that someone we thought we knew might have harmed young people like this, well, we were fooled. And we're sorry. We are grieving.
I understand your POV, and I don't think that you're making excuses. I just feel like the story you're saying that your father could have picked up the phone, but he didn't want to because around town, Jerry, this and that. For me, that's just not it. That's not enough. That's grossly indifferent to what it was a very I don't understand why he couldn't have just asked what happened with this.
But Lisa, remember. Remember, there's a couple of things that you got to put into context. You're viewing it as, and this is the presentment point of view, which is he's told about an anal rape. He's not. He's told that Jerry's in the shower after hours with a kid that made him uncomfortable. But let me take it to its fullest. Here's the other problem. Okay, with the point of view of, I want him to pick up you want him to do more. You want him to pick up the phone, and you wanted them to. So let's say he had picked up the phone and called the police in 1998 or 2001, and they decide, based on the evidence at the time, there is no victim that's come forward in 2001. No kid has come to the police. Let's say he makes that phone call and they decide not to charge Jerry. Then you fast forward to 2011, and all of a sudden you've got now all these kids that have come forward, and you've got all this evidence. Doesn't that phone call look like Dad trying to cover up for Jerry?
I don't know.
That's
I don't know. I just don't know why did he didn't have to pick. No. He didn't have to pick up the phone to the police. I just said he did what he was supposed to do. He told his superiors. Why didn't he follow up with those two superiors? That's all I'm saying. I mean, the next time he would have seen Jerry Sandusky, wouldn't. Yeah.
Well, he may have.
Right.
Wait, Lisa, you're making an assumption. He may have very well have followed up with them, but he was asked about it 11 years later. He didn't remember that. He didn't remember reaching back out to them. But he also didn't remember, I mean, we looked at the logistics of when he actually reported it. Louis Freeh made a big thing about how McQuarrie immediately told Paterno the very next day. And then he says about Paterno waited another day, waited a day to tell his bosses. Well, in fact, it's exactly the same thing, but the spin on it in that report was exactly the opposite. In fact, Joe got on a plane shortly after McQuarrie left his house to fly to, where was it? Philadelphia?
Pittsburgh.
Pittsburgh. Okay, and there's significant evidence that says that he actually called Schultz and Curley or made a call to them that day, and then followed up the next day, and then they waited a week or so before they actually talked to McQuarrie. And so I don't know what their logistics were, whether they were in town, whether things were happening, whether they looked into things in the middle. I don't know any of that. But I do know that Joe did not have a full recollection of all the things that he did. And so when you're talking about something that happened, you know, when you're asking about something that happened 11 years later, that where there's no contemporaneous documentation of what was said and done, I mean, you're dealing with, you know, pliable memory. And one of the questions I want to ask you, Scott, is one of the most damning things that's been held up against your father was that when he testified in the grand jury, that he said there was I don't know what happened, there was something inappropriate, something sexual, and that, using that word, that McQuarrie told him there was something that happened, something inappropriate, something sexual, that actually was very damning against him. And I want to ask you, first of all, when did that grand jury testimony occur? When did your father testify in the grand jury in terms of in this process? And the next thing is, what do you believe he was testifying about? His present recollection or what he was told based on the current investigation?
Well, no. So what you have is he testified in January of 2011, and he testified.
When did the presentment come out?
November. So 10 months.
Wait. So 10 months before the presentment came out, he was called into the grand jury?
Correct. He testifies in January of 11. The presentment comes out in November of 11.
Okay. And so go ahead.
Yeah. So what basically, as an attorney, when you're getting ready to have somebody testify, you go through any documentation they may have that's relevant to. And we had very little documentation as it related to Jerry, except for the stuff with the retirement docs, and he looked at that. And our conversations always, Mike said, you know, he saw something made him uncomfortable, horsing around, you know, those types of terms. When we get down to the grand jury to testify, immediately prior to him taking the stand, he's interviewed by the AG's office because they had not done a pre-interview with him, and they wanted to sort of walk through him. And I think they actually expected him, Jim, to deny that Mike had ever come to him. They were kind of taken aback when he said, yeah, Mike came to me and I reported it up. They then, you know, asked, was it something sexual in nature? That's the first time that phrase gets used with Joe in my experience up to that point. And he repeats that phrase 45 minutes later. Now,
So what you're saying is that he was asked by the Attorney General's office if Mike McQuarrie, quote, said anything to you or reported to you that he had witnessed something sexual in nature between Jerry Sandusky and this unknown boy. And that is the first time that you know of that the term sexual in nature was actually presented to him, not 11 years earlier or 10 years earlier when Mike McQuarrie came to him.
Let me be clear. That exact phrase, sexual in nature. So was it something sexual in nature? What the terminology he had used up to that point, and I can't speak to exactly what words Mike used at the time, but what terminology he had used up to that point was uncomfortable and horsing around. There was never anything about a sexual act. There was never anything about fondling or groping. That comes into the discussion as we're going through this process. And he gets asked, what were you told? And he said, you know, Mike saw the guy, saw him in the shower with a youngster. And he said, was it sexual in nature? Now, my dad had this habit of, if it's jokingly called a question talker. He would ask a question and then answer it because, he knows it's coming. Was it sexual? So I think, and it's entirely possible I'm wrong, and I'm not sitting here saying my recollection is any better than the stenographer at the time, but he said, was it sexual in nature? Not, it was. I think it got transposed at the time. It seems like a fairly innocuous transposition, but when you go back and think it through, it does come off a lot differently. Now that being said, I can hear Lisa thinking to herself, "This is all no." But let me get back to it, Lisa, because I think it's relevant. And Jim, I'm going to jump back to where we were a little bit ago about she should have done something more, because this is one of those things that has come up both at the criminal trial for the three gentlemen, and also the in Free's report, was that they made no effort to find the child, based on the report that Joe is given and that he then refers to the two people up the chain. The only person that would know who the child was Jerry. There was no way to Mike didn't see the kid's face initially. At least he said he hadn't seen the kid's face. You weren't going to pull a whole line of second mile kids in and see if Mike could pick him out of a lineup. So the only way to find out who that kid was would have been to call the offender and alert him to the fact that this had taken place. And whether that's a good idea or not, Jim, I'll leave to the law enforcement. But that was also part of the part of the struggle with these guys, is that you're dealing with a situation where there is nobody coming forward and saying I was abused. Now we know why that doesn't happen, but so when Joe's testifying and when these guys are talking, in their minds, they had done what they thought they could do with what they had. Whether that's enough, and whether you want to get into the moral debate, Lisa, I'll be happy to engage in it over beers sometime. But it's a very tough. It's a tough slope to have.
I get it.
Right, but also I think that is why the fact that they didn't go further is most likely the reason why Schultz and Curley took a plea to endangering a child, and that Spanier was actually convicted of it. It's that issue that was the information they had, even though it was sketchy, it wasn't explicitly stated, because McQuarrie testifies to this day that he never actually said the word sexual. He never said anal rape. He never said any of that to Joe, Schultz, or Curley. But what he said was that I said to them that it was way over the line and they knew what I was talking about. Now, again, that's an implication, and that's an inference that he makes. But they may have known that it was more serious than just horsing around. I'm not saying that it wasn't, but there's no evidence of that, and they claim that they didn't. So we can't just say, well, they must have, and then let it hang like that, because in fact the jury found that they could not find Jerry Sandusky guilty of actually committing the crime that they are accused of ignoring. So it's a very convoluted legal quagmire that we're in when we start just basically hypothesizing about what they must have known or must have done. So what we're left with are the facts. They stand convicted of endangering the welfare of a child, and the notes and the emails and whatever transpired in 2001 is the record that we have left. And the reason why we have that record is because Schultz actually saved those files, and he actually had a file on Sandusky, and he turned it over, right? And that's very contrary to how it came out in this movie. So why don't we talk about that, the transition files seen in this movie and the Jerry Sandusky file. Can you tell us a little bit about that, Scott?
Well, and again, my information on this is based on trial testimony and everything else, because I was not Gary's representative and I didn't speak to Gary directly about it, but it was turned over. Certainly that file was turned over by Gary's lawyers to the AG's office. It was not a situation where I think they were ever thinking he was not going to turn it over. And I think the way they portrayed his secretary, his secretary was described in one of the free, interview notes as, the first thing she said was her name, and everything else was a lie. They just chose not to believe that this was something that was kept and that they forgot that was there, and that once they had it, they turned it over, which they did in a matter of days. And there was no clandestine, bring it to me, that whole acting out that scene where his secretary brings him, but she accidentally kept a copy. None of that happened. That was all.
Yeah, but the movie doesn't say that he didn't hand it over. It's just it shows the file so that the audience can then understand what was in his transition, whatever the hell it is.
But
I mean, I don't think it says that he burned it or didn't want to hand it over.
Oh, it definitely. But it's portrayed in a way that, especially the sequence with the secretary saying, "I'm sorry, I kept the copy." That whole thing. It's portrayed in a way that it's trying to give you this sinister feel to it. When in reality, look, I think the one thing you could say about this, if this was an actual conspiracy, these guys were complete idiots and geniuses at the same time, because they managed to keep it quiet for 10, 12 years, or whatever they're claiming. But at the same time, they didn't take the step of destroying the evidence that the conspiracy existed. And it's one of those things where, look, I think what really happened here, and Jim, I've told you this from the get-go, is you had a bunch of people that didn't know how to deal with what they were dealing with and blew it. I mean, didn't realize and didn't take the extra step that we would want someone to take. And I think that's why it comes back to, and the movie is the movie. It's an historical, I mean, it's not, when I say historical, I mean, it's a point in time. It exists. It is what it is. It's entertainment. And nothing that movie says or does is going to be able to protect one kid that Jerry offended against. What hopefully it does is drive a conversation that gets people to look at, hey, look, there's a Jerry Sandusky somewhere in your town. If you have a place that has kids where there is somebody in a position of power over those kids, predators are attracted to prey. And so wherever the prey exists, I tell this to my kids all the time, if you see toads, there are snakes nearby because snakes eat toads. And if there are children, there are people that want to victimize those children that are nearby. And that's the only thing that I think, if there's one thing that offended me about the movie, Elisa, if there's one thing that bothered me the most, was they didn't take that opportunity at the end of the movie to say, if after watching this you have been triggered in any way, if after seeing this you feel you need, here are organizations like 1 in 6 that you should contact. Or
that's a really, really good point. Yeah. That's a really, really important point. But I do think that it does give voice to some of those victims. Sure. I mean, when you see Benjamin Cook, who plays Aaron Fisher, you see a face and you hear his voice and the relation with his mother and his bullying. I mean, that's a very important touchstone for people, and I think it does help the current victims and future victims, because they need a touchstone. They need to see their story. They need to hear their voices and see a victim depicted and not just the adults around them depicted.
Right. But also, Scott, I'll add one more thing to my disappointment about the film, and that is that they had a very good opportunity to discuss and at least, mention grooming and how Aaron was, sort of manipulated into silence, and how this whole process was perpetuated decade after decade by Jerry Sandusky, and they didn't. And just like Free's report that said the word grooming one time at very late in the report about Jerry continued to use the facilities at Penn State to groom his victims, they missed that opportunity to talk about it. So that's one of the reasons why, Lisa and I and Laura would be doing the same thing if she were here, but that we wanted to talk to you because this is an opportunity for us to raise the issues that should be raised. It's exactly what happened in the Nassar case. It's exactly what is happening right now in thousands of other schools and sports and teams and organizations and communities and families right now, and people need to be aware of what grooming is. Scott, can you just tell the listeners how they can get access to that pull-out part of my report that talks about grooming and compliant victimization and sex offenders?
Sure. We've kept it up on paterno.com. It's under resources, and it has a link to the 9-page. And I tell people all the time, look, there's a part that you wrote that deals with my dad's aspect of this, and then we broke out that 9-page how to spot these are the signs guide that has nothing to do with dad directly, and set that up as a separate document so people can take that down, print it out, and share it. And I told there was a guy from the Washington Post says, do you mind if we reprint some of this? I'm like, I'd like you to reprint it verbatim. The thing that and Lisa, this is one of those. People say this all the time, and I hate it when I hear it, but it's true. As a father or as a woman, when people use that, because I can qualify myself as a certain person, I can have an opinion. But in reality, there's that scene where Greg comes out as me, and he's trying to say a prayer for the victims and everything else. That actually happened. the students didn't interrupt me. It wasn't quite as rabid as they portray it. It wasn't exactly organized either. But in that moment when that's where I say I have 3 kids, that was what was going through my head. And the problem with Jim, you remember that panel we did down in Baltimore, 5 years ago? And I started off by saying, I was the problem before this started, because before it was on my doorstep, I was like everybody else. I would read a headline, I'd read 3 or 4 sentences about something that had to do with kids being abused, and I'd say a silent prayer and thank God that doesn't happen in my community and move on. And I didn't want to find out more about it. I didn't want to learn what the signs were, because that wouldn't happen in my town. I live with good people. And that's how this, if the danger of this story for me has always been the way it was portrayed as though it was some culture of football enabling a guy. It gives you the ability, gives people that aren't in our community the ability to say, well, that wouldn't happen here. And I mean, heck, the president of Michigan State, who's been fired subsequently in 2012, basically said that wouldn't happen here. And and when you read Jim's report, those 9 pages, and you read an account of how Nassar operated, it is scary how close they come to identifying the exact signs that Nassar was exhibiting.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's a very, very powerful point for sure, Scott. I hear that completely.
Yeah, no, I have just spent the last 30 years of my professional career working on figuring out how to identify these guys and trying to get that word out to people. And fortunately, the Paterno family has put up that website, and they have. I mean, Scott has repeatedly over these past years tweeted about it, and I know Sue Paterno, his mother, has told people about it. And the thing is, they're trying to get the word out because they were victims of Sandusky's grooming. The whole community there was. And it's so effective. It is so effective at getting people to believe that it's not possible that this person was actually doing something bad to kids. And that's just something that, people out there have to accept. There are people, everybody listening to this, there are people that you have run across somewhere in your daily lives that are actually sexually interested in kids. You can't see it on their faces, but if you're savvy enough, you can see it in their behavior, and you have to scrutinize them, especially the ones that you are handing your children over to. That's just critically important.
Well, the report had a couple of aims. One was to get to the truth, and I think that's more important than anything. And the second thing is if we could also create some heightened level of awareness about nice guy predators, we felt that would be probably more important than anything.
Scott, you had mentioned the conspiracy theory and stuff around this, but I just want to point out to the listeners that no one has been convicted of any charges related to a conspiracy of conspiring to allow Jerry Sandusky to do what he was doing or to hide what he was doing in order to protect the football program. In fact, that allegation in the Free Report has never been supported, and there is absolutely no evidence of it. And there has been, the jury rejected it.
Yeah, it was presented in the Spaniard case, and it was and they were acquitted of those charges. So I mean, that's the problem with it is when you get into the term conspiracy and everyone wants to get this is. It just there was never any evidence of it. The AG's office even came out and affirmatively said there was no evidence that Joe Paterno was involved in any cover-up. He said that 2 years after he was dead. He said at the time, But the important thing, and the lesson is you don't need a conspiracy for a guy like that to succeed. You don't need to have enablers, as is the term we like to use now, for a predator to work. In fact, a lot of the times, as you pointed out to me, they don't want enablers. They don't want anyone to know what their private life is. So that's why they create this public persona that is unassailable.
Right. So in 1998, the movie depicts that your father wanted constant updates about what was going on with Jerry Sandusky and the allegations back then. Do you know anything about that and whether or not that's accurate?
No, that didn't happen. I mean, and the reason being, that was the weekend this all took place with Jerry in '98 was my brother's wedding. So that, a lot of the stuff that was going on at that time, he was basically just trying to keep my mother from chewing his head off for not being more helpful. But yeah, Dad, if he was told it all, it would have been. I think Tim's testimony was, I think I told Coach, just a quick cursory, this is going on. I'll let you know if there's anything you need to know. And that when they came back, according to Tim's testimony, and Dad doesn't recall any of this, or didn't recall any of this before he died. It was that he told Joe that they'd found nothing, that it was nothing. So I mean that was what would have happened in '98, since the DA's office made the decision not to charge. Right. Again, there's some the overall, like I said, I wasn't comfortable with a lot of the depictions in the movie, and I'm not going to tick off a list of things they got wrong, but at the same time, the real failing in some of those dramatic license situations is it does give the impression that there was some type of organized defense for Jerry that both wasn't true and also gives, again, that false impression that a predator like that or an offender like Jerry needs that type of an apparatus to be successful. In fact, what they really need is for people not to know and just think they are.
I didn't feel like it, but I didn't see that it was organized. I just felt like it was these two administrators just not wanting to go. They're just passing the buck. I didn't quite see it that way, okay, which is why I thought it was a little bit of a fair, I was surprised. I thought it would be much more judgmental, that way. So I was interested that they kept it a little bit more open,
Yeah, and I think both Scott and I are looking at sort of the overall context, of everything that was said and done in all those years since this presentment came out. So maybe you are fresher eyes and less invested and in the story. So it's interesting that you found it to be much more open and not as sort of pushing the agenda of, that they deliberately were involved in this conspiracy to make it okay for
even in some of the scenes. Well, even in some of the scenes where they show, I forget, it was Schultz or Spanier saying, "Oh yeah, Joe's okay with us not doing this or that." I felt like maybe he was just saying that, that it didn't necessarily mean that your father was wanting them to not go to the Department of Health and Human Services or whatever it is, or the police, but they just used him as a way of not escalating or whatever. But anyway, that was just
I didn't take it that way, but again, I think Jim's correct. I mean, it's impossible for me to view any of this stuff with anything other than I've seen way too much detail. Like, and again, that's why I'm trying not to be, to paint the entire movie with the same brush. But there were certainly scenes where they are trying to create this impression of something a lot more sinister than what really the evidence depicted, and that's the danger in that. And I guess this is where I'm pretty easygoing in this one respect. I've made my peace. I know who my father was, and people can think what they want to think. It's not going to change my opinion of him one bit. And I don't get overly worked up about other people's opinions. I do have a problem with the way it was depicting the overall. I mean, for example, there was the scenes they kept showing him with that magnifying glass, trying to read what he wrote on that document about the no kids, no second mile kids liability issues. That document was turned over to the AG's office the day he testified, because I found it in his desk. We went over it, and as Jim can tell you as a lawyer, when you go in with somebody to testify, you tell the person who's going to examine. He's reviewed these because he's going to get asked, "Did you review any documents?" And you want to be able to say, yes, he reviewed these documents and this is what he came in. We handed that over that day. And when I asked him cold, without giving him any chance to think about it, what did this mean? He said, we were worried about that, kid getting a weight dropping on his foot. And because Jerry was going to be a retiree, he no longer would be considered a Penn State official for the insurance policy that would cover a kid, so that he couldn't supervise a kid in their weight room because he wasn't a Penn State employee. Now, obviously, Jerry had other reasons for being there, but they didn't know. They did not know. In 1997 and 98 and 99, when they're negotiating this, the only thing that had been reported had been found to be nothing and not charged. So they're dealing with this in a vacuum of, and yet the movie decides to portray it as, Joe's going back and trying to remember, what did I mean? Did I think those kids were going to be abused? He never had that thought. There was never that doubt. in his mind, when I talked to him, he was told about something that was described fairly benignly compared to how it's now portrayed. More horsing
Yeah,
around.
I got that.
And
Definitely got that
yeah,
from those scenes.
okay.
The issue of liability became critical in this case because it appeared, just by looking at that note on the side of Jerry's retirement negotiation documents, that it appeared that Joe may have written a note saying that it's a liability having Jerry bring kids in here because he could sexually victimize them. And the fact is that when they looked into this, it's basically insurance only covers liability for people who have a legitimate purpose on the campus, and that would flow from them being invited by somebody who actually worked there, not somebody who was retired and just had privileges for himself. And so that was the liability that it referred to, not a liability for sexually victimizing children. So on its face, when they depicted that in the movie, even though you may not have read it that way, Lisa, the people who know the context of that would have read it maybe a different way.
I got the sense that he was rereading the document and seeing it with fresh eyes now. Like, oh, fuck, this, I don't know.
Right,
Well,
but that particular
that
phrase,
that's what cracks me up.
Sorry. No, I'm sorry. That's just me. I'm just
particular.
Got me right. I use it too. I mean, that was one of the things. It's funny because as I'm sitting here, and Jim, I'm coming at this from a completely different perspective now. Because my kids are now old enough. When this all broke, my oldest was only 8 years old, Lisa. So he did not see the news reports, and I didn't expose him to any of the stories. So now the movie comes out. He's got friends at school that have seen it and everything else, and I'm now approaching it from the yes, your dad uses that word. That's me. And I'm like, and you just drove back from Massachusetts with me. I use that word on the highway. But it's but some of the tone and what they were trying to accomplish. Look, I can tell you that it was better than I thought it was going to be because I feared they were going to go too far. But they end the movie with this phone call to Sarah Ganem about 1976. Now that to me is one of the most disingenuous scenes in the movie, especially considering the fact that she was an advisor to it. She never got. She didn't report 76. She got a call from somebody that claimed that they had been victimized in 1971. That story that CNN eventually ran, they originally couldn't run because we said, you don't have any evidence here. This is all just speculation. Mm-hmm. The guy that from that the 71 claim just didn't match up with Jerry in any way, shape, or form. Doesn't make any sense. And came off as uncredible. So that's why they shifted to the 76 claim and made it look like she got that. Now, the 76 claim is also, this is where Jim, where you and I talked a couple years ago. The two claims that are the two outliers, the 71, 76, you have victims that are claiming a very aggressive, like pick up off the street and rape me situation, or in front of other people, sexually assault me situation, which were both outside of Jerry's MO. Now, did they meet Jerry? Did they have contact? I don't know. But I know that what was described didn't factually match up. There were other elements that I could get into, but I don't want to. Let me rephrase that. Not that I don't want to. I don't think I can because I saw some of this as part of a lawsuit under seal. But there were details that didn't match up, and that so that HBO ending on that theme made it creates this impression that Joe knew since 76. I was 4 years old in 1976. I mean, there's no way that had my father had an inkling that a guy was going to abuse kids when he had a 4-year-old, an 8-year-old, a 10-year-old, a 12-year-old, and a 14-year-old living under his roof, that it would have been, my dad, look, I drove him nuts, but he didn't hate me. I mean, he would have, given me a heads up, and there was never anything. There was never a keep your eye on this or don't be this. And keep in mind, Lisa, I was in a shower in the locker room at age 13 with 3 or 4 other people and Jerry Sandusky after a workout. Now, I didn't work out with him. I just happened to be in the shower and he was in the shower. And so I would have been potentially exposed to the type of, of risk. Now, I don't think he would have come after me, obviously, for obvious reasons, but but your father, you would think, would tell you if he had an inclination that this is the possibility this guy's going to.
And I think that's one thing that was actually done very well in the movie, where Sue tells Joe that, well, the pools at the bowl games, he was in the water throwing our kids around. He was in the water with them. You never would have let him be in the water. You would never have let your kids be in the water with him if you had any clue that he was molesting boys. And I think that's true. And I think behavior speaks a lot louder than words sometimes. And if you look at the history and what he did, and also, you know, you're not saying this, so I'm going to say this, and I learned this only after I started diving into this case, was that, you know, Joe really put the students first. I mean, he made his athletes students before they were athletes. That he said that's the most important thing. Very few of you will go on to play professional football, so you're going to have to get an education, and I'm not going to let you go through school just skating by because you're a great football player. And so he graduated more athletes than almost any other school in the country. And that's important because that's what kind of person he was. And that's inconsistent with the kind of person who had damaging information or information about a risk that would be posed to children. And then he would just ignore that and put his own kids in that risky position.
Well, I do agree that the end of the movie with the Sarah Ganem call, you know, that definitely, I wish that wasn't there. I think that, you know, I think it didn't need to be there and it kind of drops a shoe that doesn't need to be dropped. But
hey, Lisa, anyway. You know what's crazy about that 76 claim? His lawyer gave a quote, or I'm sorry, a partner at the law firm that represents the guy that's the 76 claimant gave a quote saying, "I don't believe you can condemn somebody based on these unconnected, unsupported allegations." This is after they settled the guy's case. So, I mean, like, you know, so, I mean, some of this stuff, and this is the problem, Jim, I think we talked about in terms earlier about the presentment being so specific in some other ways. Certainly, there's a process here that may have invited some people to come in and with embellished stories. And that's a shame because there was so much that was real that needed to be dealt with.
Yeah,
that and my problem is this logical fallacy that, you know, that people will employ. If you can prove one of these guys is lying, then they all must be lying, and that's
right.
You know,
and that's
bullshit,
that's outrageous. But you know, along that point though, what stands out to me as the most outlying of that allegation in 76, and I believe the same with 71, is that the fact that these boys at this time say that they found a way to have direct access to Joe Paterno at that time in a way that would somehow legitimize their claim against Jerry Sandusky. And it's unfortunate that they thought that was something that was necessary, because in the end, you know, it's just when you hear that part of the story about, well, I told this counselor that I wanted to talk to Joe, so he hooked me right up with Joe, and where Joe is, you know, he's the head coach of the football team. You know, he's not. This is a kid who's at a camp that Joe has nothing to do with, and in both, and then the other one where, well, my father said, I'm not going to call the police about you being sexually assaulted by Jerry Sandusky, but I'm going to call Joe Paterno. I mean, those two claims seem to be a little outlandish.
And to me, the underlying allegations too are just as, you know, because you talk about the situation with the guys at a camp. He claims that he told several players that it took place in a shower in front of people. Can't identify any of the players, and he's talking about a time period in 1976 or whatever it was, 71, that players weren't on campus. So this is, you know, people don't realize that, you know, before the mid to late 80s, college kids went home in the summer. Like, players went home in the summer. It's only been, I think the NCAA rule changed maybe 89 or 90 that allowed you to have a weight program and a counseling program for your players during the summer. They used to have to, you know, be away from football. And as that has evolved, you know, then it became commonplace that if you went into a locker room or a football building in the offseason, there'd probably be 6 or 7 or 8 players, you know, working out or being around. Back in those days, it didn't happen. You know, Dad's office and the weight room or the locker room where this would have allegedly taken place were separated by 2 miles or a mile and a half. I mean, it wasn't like they weren't even in the same building. So some of this stuff just doesn't add up. And the sad part about it is, you know, if somebody's using a single false claim to discredit legitimate claims, whether it be in this situation or in a Nassar situation or in a rape situation in other, in other areas, that's a problem. because the second we start letting one false claim invalidate everything, we lose sight of the other side of this. There's no absolute on either end.
The only scene I wanted to bring up that I really appreciated was there's a scene when Sarah Ganem's character goes to see the therapist, I believe a therapist or social worker who had been with Aaron Fisher. And he's like, this whole big drama regarding Joe Paterno, it's just distracting from the actual crime. That he's becoming the center of this when it should be the victims. And I thought that was a very powerful statement. I mean, would you agree?
Absolutely. No, I think, and that's one of the situations that I thought that I recalled at the time. There was that I think they got that one accurately correct. I think that therapist actually said that at one point publicly, that it's distracting from the story that should be being discussed.
Right, but I think there's also a little nuance in there towards the end where he basically is saying that this is the story's being usurped about, and it's all about Joe Paterno, and then he kind of throws in he didn't do what he was supposed to do or something like that at the end. Well, that was his sort of his theory about it. But
sure,
it's not, that's not necessarily accurate. However, I do know, and having read Aaron's book, his counselor actually participated in and wrote, alternating chapters in that book. It's unfortunate, but he didn't have the level of experience to actually deal with understanding what was going on at the time. I mean, the Attorney General's office took 3 years to put together that case, and that's a long time. And what they didn't do was protect potential victims during that time period, and that's really unfortunate. But what they were trying to do was get other victims so that they didn't just have a one-person victim against one-person offender, he said going on, and that would have put tremendous amount of pressure on Aaron as a victim to testify alone. And I think in the end, they put together a really strong case that convicted Jerry Sandusky because they amassed all these victims and all this information and all the cross corroboration that they needed. It takes time because the first time that they approached most of these victims denied it. And that's part of compliant victimization. That's part of being a victim of grooming and a victim of sexual victimization, which ingrains shame and fear and guilt in the victims. And so they shut up about it. They don't disclose. And they, especially when it's a male victim and a male offender, and these are adolescent kids, these are adolescent boys when they were being victimized. And it's very difficult for them to actually admit that they did not have an immediate outcry in a situation in which they were sexually victimized by an adult male. So I think that I just wanted to sort of lay that out because I think that's a really important part that, again, the movie didn't get into, but they're not as sophisticated in this area as we are. And I'm glad we're talking about it. And I'm glad our listeners have an opportunity to hear about it.
And one last actor shout out. I want to shout out Riley Keough, who played Sarah Ganem. And if you don't know this, Riley is the granddaughter of Elvis Presley, and she's a wonderful actress. And I thought she did a really great job in this role. So there you go.
Well, thank you so much, Lisa, and thank you so much, Scott. And, we both, Lisa and I want to cheer on Laura with her work in the UK. Scott, Laura, our co-host, is working in the UK, fighting for rights for victims of stalking and coercive control, and she's doing an amazing job.
That's right. She's kicking ass in Ireland right now. And Scott, it was so great to talk to you. I hope, it's just great to talk to the source of something,
Right. I appreciate it. And
thank
again,
you for putting up with my mishigash. So I appreciate it.
And please,
I do appreciate it, guys. And I do hope that once again, people will get a chance to read Jim's great work that he did for us back in 2012 and 13 and find the signs out. Learn how to protect your kids and your friends' kids.
Oh, yeah. And if anybody is triggering, which I'm sure many people are off of this conversation, Jim, where can people go right away to get help, advice, counseling?
Malesurvivor.org is a great organization. It's an international organization, and you can go on their website, and there's there are resources listed there. Stopitnow.org is also another great organization. Darkness to Light.org is another great organization, and Safe for Athletes, safe the number 4 athletes.org is a great place if you have a sport, a team, a organization, any place that's a youth serving organization can get valuable information about protecting kids and putting in place procedures to help prevent child sexual victimization from happening.
I would add one more. I would add 1 in 6 as another great one, especially for adult males who are coping with what they're learning about their past in a lot of cases.
Absolutely. 1 in 6. 1in6.org is another great organization that helps male survivors of child sexual victimization. And I think maybe we didn't do this before, but I think I should do this just to put on the record. And I met Scott Paterno after I was hired by a law firm that was representing their family to look into the free report and whether or not the allegations that were listed in the executive summary and Free's report actually were supported by the evidence that was documented in the rest of that report. And so I was hired by that law firm. They did pay me, and I put in, a lot of hours, both looking at that report, reviewing that report, analyzing it, and then other documents and transcripts and so forth over the course of many months. And then at some point, I did meet Scott Paterno and interviewed him about aspects of what went on during that time. And then eventually, after the report was published, I met more members of your family, including your mother. And my heart goes out to your entire family, and I'm sorry, so sorry for your loss. I mean, your dad seems like he was a pretty amazing guy, and he seems to have done pretty good with his children. And he certainly picked an amazing wife, your mother.
Well, I appreciate that. I will tell you that as far as condolences, my dad had a great life, and he died at 84, surrounded by his family with his wife's hand on his cheek, with sunlight streaming on his face. He couldn't have asked. It's if you got to go, that's the way to go.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, what a great way to look at it.
Well, thank you for giving us insights into his life and your life and the experience of your family during this time period. And we hope that our listeners take what they've learned today and take the message that they really need to scrutinize people that are around their children, that are around children in their community who have some of these red flag behaviors. And if you want to learn more about it, please read that pullout part at paterno.com. and in the resources section, and hopefully that will help you get a better understanding and take the Darkness to Light training. That training is for everybody in the world. Anybody can take it, and
it's free right now.
I think, yeah, it's free right now. I think you can do it online as well, and that's a wonderful thing because it helps arm people in the community against offenders who are grooming and violating the trust of people who know and trust and love them. So please be part of the army that fights against child sexual victimization. Thank you.
If you like our podcasts, there are a few things you can do. You can take 2 minutes and go to Apple Podcasts and leave a 5-star review. You can also check out all Real Crime Profile offers and promotions and our sponsors in our show notes. Another thing you can do is go to Facebook and like our Facebook page, and you can also follow us on Twitter at Real Crime Profile without the E. And one last thing, please tell your friends, family and colleagues about us and spread the Real Crime Profile word. Thank you so much for listening. We really appreciate all of our listeners.
Real Crime Profile is produced and edited by Paul Francis Sullivan. Sound engineering by Mike Thal. Music is composed by Simba Tsumba. Logo art by Jim Clementi. Real Crime Profile is produced by XG Productions and distributed by Wondery.
For advice and support if you're experiencing stalking in the UK, you can contact Paladin National Stalking Advocacy Service on 0203 866 4107, or you can go to the website where there's a lot of information and advice that you can follow on www.paladinservice.co.uk. If you're experiencing domestic abuse, you can call the National Domestic Violence Helpline for free on 0800 2000 247. In the US, if you're experiencing domestic abuse and need advice, shelter or counselling, you can call Genesis, the 24-hour hotline, on 214-946-4357. You can also go to their website for further advice or support, www.genesisshelter.org. And there's the Domestic Violence Hotline on 800-799-7233.